Welcome to Tell Us a Story, the podcast dedicated to the stories that connect us through our shared life experiences, as well as the stories that reveal the sometimes stark differences. Only by truly listening to one another can we bridge the gaps that divide us, fostering empathy, respect, and kindness with one another. In this episode, Dr. Teresa Smallwood weaves a story that begins growing up poor in rural North Carolina, becoming a lawyer, and finally winds its way to her current stop in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania as a professor. Each thread of this story builds up to the whole that has prepared her for the challenges that this moment is offering, not only to her, but to all of us. So listen as Dr. Smallwood tells us a story.
So I am from rural northeastern North Carolina, and I grew up really rather poor, but it was always my intention to understand and know the story of my people and to engage it in ways that I thought could be helpful. So when I graduated high school, it was very clear education would be the only thing to take me out of that little small rural agrarian setup. Went on to UNC Chapel Hill, got my undergraduate degree in African American Studies and speech communication, went on to law school, got a law degree, and after law school, I worked for more than 20 years as a practicing attorney. I started out in what we call public interest law. So I did things like help keep people in their homes, defend them on unemployment decisions that were adverse, working with them to get benefits, AFDC and things of that nature, Social Security, that kind of thing. But I went back home, and the first job that was available was an assistant district attorney, which meant I was moving over to the next side. And I told people I went from winning very few times to winning all the time because I was now representing the state. But I did that work for 3 years. And it was very rewarding work because I had a chance to see what it was like to be on the other side. But the district attorney who I worked for lost his bid for re-election one year, and that sent me into a decision-making process. I either was going to go to another big state and try to find a job, or I was going to hang my shingle and become a private attorney. And so that's what I did. I opened up a practice in 1991, and I worked until 2007 in that practice. And so the practice itself was very rewarding for me until I started to realize that I had represented upwards of 5 generations in one family, trying to overcome poverty and using drugs as the way out. And it just became depressing. And then we had a tremendous flood in that area. And the flood put my law office underwater. And the next thing I know, I'm, pursuing a Master's of Divinity. Really and truly, a lot of people have suggested that I was running away from the call. I'm not sure that's the case. It might be. But certainly I found it. And now I really feel like I'm doing the work that my soul must have. So when an opportunity arose some years later, having gone back to school to get this degree as a PhD, and the opportunity came to work in Pennsylvania, I was given the choice of either Philadelphia or Gettysburg. And so I think it's really important to note that I chose Gettysburg. And I chose Gettysburg because of both my knowledge of the history of Africans who have lived in America, and those, of course, will be my ancestors, and then those of us who have continued on. Why Gettysburg? Why not Philadelphia, where there's so much action, so much going on, so much happening? First and foremost, it's a part of my rural destiny to be in a setup where I can see grass and look at trees and be in a location where I really, really do understand the capacity for society to grow out of places where food is grown, where we have all kinds of orchards and peaches and apples. That kind of rural setting is what draws my spirit. But more than anything, I was interested in just learning more about this place where everything turned around in the Civil War. And the more I really researched it, I realized very little had been told to me in my formal education about Africans or African Americans and any contribution they may have had or any effects of their lives having lived here in Gettysburg. And so I'm here because that is what I really want to know about. Almost immediately, the president of this glory school invited me to be a part of the Seminary Ridge Education Center and Museum Board of Directors. And I've become really good friends with Peter Mealy. I've come to understand and know that there is a story. And that story, I think, flowers my own understanding of the experiences of Africans in America. Because what it does is it tells me that there was a lot of real tension behind how we would fit in the context of what America is, and then what the role might be. And when you look at all of the institutional ways in which knowledge has been produced in this country, there are some stories that have been left out. Now, I start with my own ancestors. One of the things that understanding the history of the Civil War does for me is to put in perspective what my mother went through as a child. Something as simple as health care is really not an issue for me. I have a wonderful health care plan. But in 1919, when she was born, having a doctor was almost unheard of. And any doctor that she would have seen was someone who rode a horse and buggy and essentially came around maybe once every 2 or 3 months. My mother had a terrible fever in her right leg. And that fever, because it was unattended, froze that right leg joint. And so for the rest of her life, after about age 14, she had a joint that would not move. So she had a limp. And as a result then, everything she did, she limped to do it. Now here I am in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, with wonderful health care and an understanding about how to get what I need. But my mother and so many others who were here didn't have such. And I also think about my dad. My father grew up in a town similar to my mother, but when they came together, they obviously lived in Windsor, North Carolina, where I was born and raised. But he didn't even finish the 4th grade. And I'm just amazed at the fact that my dad didn't even have a high school education. And yet he provided, he worked, he did what he had to do to help take care of his family. But when I think about educational opportunities and the fact that I'm sitting here as a PhD with a degree that allows me to create new PhDs, it speaks to what I think was a big trope in my theological grounding. The older people would say things like, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest." And as I came along, we sang a song that said, "I don't feel no ways tired." Putting those two songs together and that meaning has helped me understand the progress that we've made in this country. There are a lot of people who would take issue with that concept of progress. But I have to know, based upon the experiences of the folk in my family, I have to know that God has been with us and that progress has been made. Because I still believe in the fact that God has God's hands on the heart of all kings and queens. And even though you may have the intention of harming me, no weapon that's formed against me can prosper. I also think about when I grew up in Berkeley County, there was still lots of separation. So we had, black schools and white schools. And it wasn't until my elementary years that segregation was outlawed. So as a result then, when we were given an opportunity to go to school with our white counterparts in Berkeley County, lots of clashes happened. And I went back to my high school reunion, which would have been 40 plus years this past year. And I'm telling you, I saw people I hadn't seen in that many years. But it was just like we were in 1978 when we graduated. Black, white, loving on each other, remembering stories, telling stories, and understanding that we were in one time frame. But we're certainly now in another time frame. And what we have in common is a whole lot more than what we would say could divide us. So even in my upbringing, I can see the change that has happened. And I can really just grab a hold of hope. Hope is important to me because as I think about, the kinds of political races going on, the opportunities that are happening within the criminal courts around former president, all of these things make you feel like it's hopeless. But I have great hope because I've seen over the years the hand of one that continues to make things better. When I talk about hope, I am framing in the context of Martin Luther King Jr. and his work. The whole corpus itself is represented primarily in a book that is a compilation called A Testament of Hope. And that book, in many instances, it has all of the speeches, it has all of the major interviews, all of the ways in which King's sort of corpus itself establishes itself over time. But when I think about hope, what that testament does is it helps me establish what I've known since I was a kid, since before I actually was baptized. I remember the old people repeating a passage of scripture that says, you ought to always have a way of sharing with others the hope that lies within you. And the reason I always lead to that when I talk about my history and my experiences, my journey, is because just like Jesus, no one would have thought a little girl from northeastern North Carolina, most rural agrarian setting there is, on the bottom of the totem pole when it comes to, what the educational rankings might be in that state. No one would think that I could show up here with a PhD, previously representing the law. That would be unheard of except for the concept of hope. And you know who had it first? Who planted the seed in me? It was Maddie Matilda Cherry Smallwood, my mom. My mother, despite her disability, never understood what disability meant. She never had a handicap sticker. She never had special parking. She never had any of those things because they hadn't even been invented actually. But my mother worked hard. And for her little girl, the only child she had hope that I would do well and be somebody. And while I know lots of people don't measure their success by what they've achieved educationally or otherwise, I tend to look at all of it holistically and say that it couldn't come about if my mama hadn't been steeped in the idea that there is a hope. And that hope is built on nothing less than our belief in a Jesus, in a Christ, in a preference for there to be a better day. This location opens up for me the concept of a dialogue that goes along with public theology, When we talk theology, a lot of people want to keep it as a private institution. But I am more and more convinced that until people live their faith out loud and really, really come to grips with what it means to say you are a disciple of Christ, in order to make that claim, there are lots of things that we continue to hold in tension that we need to find some way to reconcile. And reconciliation, restoration, justice, reparation, all of those things become so very important to not only my sojourn, my journey, if you will, but they are important to the popular discourse in America right now. So much of what we are doing as a country is either problematizing or disrupting the very notion of a democratic society. And that seems to be a trope during the Civil War. Who can be free? Who will be free? Who has the right to participate in its government? Who has the right to suggest ways of policy being established? And as I have begun to look at this, I know that I have been placed in the right place. I know that Gettysburg will continue to reward me with new understandings, not only about human behavior, but also about history. I'm learning, for instance, that the house I live in right now is actually a place where a black woman served that family. Can you imagine what it's like to be making my dinner at the oven, walking through that home, and realizing that the person who would have been here, who looks like me, a century and a half or so ago, would have been in bondage? And while I don't know what the circumstances were, I feel certain that she was in the care of people who were humane. But the bottom line is, it is information that I didn't have before. And it flowers my story because now I'm there. I'm there as a representative. I'm there as someone who would have been perhaps a part of her dream. Someone who's there not to serve, but to be served. And at the same time, to come into this institution and not just be here, but to teach others. That's important because as we think about breaking the chains, those chains were both physical and psychological. And breaking the chains of psychological bondage, I believe, is a much more involved task than even those physical changes. But when it comes to that psychological bondage, I'm finding that even as we think about a new presidential race in this country, and so many governmental systems are trying to shut people down, close us off from knowledge, shake up what we thought we knew, and even roll back some of the progress we thought we made. Those kinds of things within the context of my own little, rural agrarian start become humongous in the way I plan my life moving forward. I just turned 64 in November. And perhaps I've lived more years than I have to go forward. But as I move and live and have my being in this world, I've come to understand the importance of that kind of history because it will shape what I do with young people, how I approach their knowledge production. It will shape how I handle my ancestors and their histories. And it will most definitely shape the folk who come in my classroom. I don't want them leaving my classroom with theological understandings that don't have any kind of understanding about what people's plight has been. Because how in the world can you be pastoral when you have never even formed an idea about what people have been up against? it's interesting. I see a real correlation between the work I do now and the work I did before. As a lawyer, I was always in the work of dealing with people's socio-economic situation. It was just in a different realm. The realm I worked in was criminal defense, wrongful death, personal injury. At one point, I became the lawyer for the school board, but that work was much more corporate. My real bread and butter was criminal defense. And so in that, I really did put my ministry kinds of hats on a lot, doing the counseling. They call us attorneys and counselors of law. And I also recall there being a great deal of prayer going into certain young people. People who had never had records, and I was the person who stood between them and going to prison. So I really think that was a sort of preparation ground for the work I do now, because as I design and help students design their projects and I respond to what they're doing, I have a whole system of thinking that goes with this, and law is always a part of it. As a matter of fact, one of my favorite people to study is Pauli Murray, who was an Episcopal priest, but she was also a lawyer whose work inspired people who were on the Supreme Court. In fact, it was Pauli Murray's work that essentially established what it means to have discrimination on the basis of sex. And so these kinds of correlations help me when I'm helping students think about shame and vulnerability, think about what COVID-19 and post-pandemic life ought to be like in churches. It is also very, very key to how it is that I approach things like public theology, because you don't get past the law if you're studying somebody like Dietrich Bonhoeffer or Martin Luther King Jr., because both of them had run-ups with the law that are similar in many respects to the folk I would be representing. And what I noticed about that, really, in the long run, is that the legal system itself helped me understand and know the importance of getting out of the legal system, because it really truly is a system, and every round might go higher and higher, but it's still going around the same old mountain, if you will. And so I've learned now that greater skills come with having a true grounding. I've been grounding myself since being here in Gettysburg with things other than what I grew up with. So I've opened myself to insight. I've opened myself to meditation. I've opened myself to hearing new vistas of learning. And all of it has really helped me to understand how the process, the journey, actually informs and to some degree defines where you end up.
Thank you for listening to Dr. Smallwood's story. A link to her bio is available in the show notes. Please also see the show notes for more information about this podcast, or visit us at tellusastory.info.